The OSD has joined. And I believe the time in, and what's the time in London now?
It's just gone 12 o'clock.
Exactly, right, that's it.
Yeah.
তুমি একটু তখন সরে গেলে তো কতক্ষণ 5টার সময় আবার চলে আসবে।
Don't need that.
আসতে চাইছে কেউ কি এখানটা একটু দেখি এটা হ্যাঁ আছে হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে এখন আর চ্যাট করার কিছু নেই আচ্ছা এখানে দেবো এখানে যারা যারা অ্যাক্টিভ করেন এখানে যারা ক্লিক করবেন শেষ ঠিক আছে ওখানে চলে যারা যারা আসবে তাদের ওখানে নামটা ফুটে উঠবে আর অ্যাক্টিভ যখন হবে মানে ওরা তখন এখানে লগ ইনের জন্য কাছে ইয়েতে পারমিশন ওই তো অ্যাডমিট করতে দুটো করলাম দুটো করে নিলাম আরো কয়েকজনের মধ্যে ঢুকে আসার কথা ছিল হয়তো নেটের গন্ডগোল আছে যে কন্ডাক্ট করবে আমার এই কলিগ নিবেদিতা ওকে 4:30 বলেছিলাম কন্ডাক্ট করতে দেখে 2-3 মিনিট দেখবো 4:30 বেজে গেছে হ্যাঁ নেট একটা বিশাল ব্যাপার নেটে নজরে আমি এখানেই এলাম কারণ নেট ভীষণ গন্ডগোল করছে এই তো যা বলেছি তাই, ঠিক আছে। এই তো নিবেদিতা জয়েন করে গেছে, ঠিক আছে। নিবেদিতা, পিকচারটা স্টিল পিকচার দেখছি, হ্যাঁ চলে আসবে, হ্যাঁ জয়েন হয়ে গেছে।
হ্যাঁ সুমিতা, আমি জয়েন করেছি।
হ্যাঁ দেখতে পাচ্ছি, আমায় দেখতে পাচ্ছ?
হ্যাঁ দেখতে পাচ্ছি।
মাস্ক নিয়ে, তাই তো?
হ্যাঁ
তাই তো, এই তো আমি মাস্ক নিয়ে,
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
দেখতে
হ্যাঁ
পাচ্ছ আমায়? হ্যাঁ 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 হ্যাঁ, মাস্কটা তো খুলতে পারছি না, বুঝতে পারছো তো? ঠিক আছে,
নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই।
হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে। ঠিক 5টায় শুরু হবে। প্রফেসর ইহিট এসে গেছেন। আমি শুধু ভাইস চ্যান্সেলরের জন্য ওয়েট করছি, আর দুজন স্পিকার যারা রয়েছে, স্পিকার তো দরকার। ওই আরেকজন তরুণ, দেখতে পাচ্ছেন? তরুণ, এই যে তরুণ,
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
শুনতে পাচ্ছেন, দেখতে পাচ্ছেন কি? এই যে মাস্ক পরে আমি।
হ্যাঁ 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 পরিষ্কার পরিষ্কার।
Very nice to have you with us.
হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে স্যার।
হ্যাঁ আজকেই তো, হ্যাঁ এই 7:15 মধ্যে শেষ করবো। না না, আমি ওর ছোট রকমতে রাখি একদম। আজকে আপনাদের সকাল থেকে বোধহয় পরীক্ষাটাও কি আপনাদেরই করতে হয়েছে না? একটা পরীক্ষা চলছিল না, কোথায় হয়েছে বলুন? হ্যাঁ তাই, আচ্ছা। হ্যাঁ সিআইআরএম কে বাদ দিয়ে অনলাইনে পরীক্ষা। এই যে অনির্বাণ এসো। ওয়েলকাম অনির্বাণ। হ্যাঁ এগুলো স্পিকাররা এসে গেলেই ভালো। ওই তো একজন স্পিকার। Yes sir, welcome. Yes sir, আমাকে দেখতে পাচ্ছেন?
হ্যাঁ আমি
Yes sir,
দেখতে তো পাচ্ছি।
এই যে আমি এখানে স্যার।
হ্যাঁ দেখতে পাচ্ছি। Can you hear me?
Of course, most distinctly.
Very good.
Would you like to speak first or second sir? আপনি কি ফার্স্টে বলবেন?
হ্যাঁ বলে দিই, আমি যখন এসেই গেছি, উঠেই যখন পড়েছি।
আচ্ছা তাহলে আপনি প্রথমে বলবেন। আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, প্লিজ বি উইথ আস।
Sure, হ্যাঁ, no problem.
স্যারকে এই কথা বলছে। হ্যাঁ, স্যারকে জয়েন করিয়ে দাও গো। এটা প্রথম স্পিকার তো এসে গেছেন, উনি বলছেন আগে বলবেন, নো প্রবলেম। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তুমি যাই না এখনো জয়েন করেননি, তুমি একটু একটু দেখো। হ্যাঁ আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ আমি ছাড়ছি।
Approximately how many people are expected?
Well, almost 550 have registered, and you will be surprised to know that 10 minutes before I started for the university, our Honorable Vice Chancellor is here.
Okay.
Registration, sir, welcome, sir. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor has joined just now. Sir, আপনি দেখতে পাচ্ছেন? স্যার, দেখতে পাচ্ছেন? Our Honorable Vice Chancellor has joined. You will be inaugurating the program. Yes, Professor Mitro, you are asking me. The program will start at 5 o'clock. Nearly 550 have registered.
Okay. So right now it is 4:52. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
And the language of the.
In fact, you speak in English.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
So welcome, sir. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor has just joined in, sir. Sir, আসুন স্যার, আপনাকে স্বাগত জানাই। আমরা ঠিক 5টায় শুরু করব।
Sure.
আচ্ছা।
ঠিক আছে।
Professor Ghosh, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
We are fine, as fine as possible under the circumstances.
Right. Throughout the globe.
So what is your, if you don't mind, what is your plan for the university starting? এক্ষুনি টেলিগ্রাফে দেখলাম যে সব কলেজ একটু দেরিতে আরম্ভ হচ্ছে নাকি?
হ্যাঁ, একটু এখনো আমাদের রেজাল্টটা বেরোয়নি আর কি, মানে এক্সামিনেশনটা নিতে পারিনি তো, এটা নিয়ে একটা ট্রাসেল চলছে কিভাবে এক্সামিনেশনটা নেব। ইনফ্যাক্ট স্টেট ইউনিভার্সিটি দে ওয়ান্ট টু ডিসাইড 80-20 লাইক দ্যাট, নো? সব পরীক্ষা তো নেওয়া এখন খুব মুশকিল হচ্ছে আর কি, যা অবস্থা খুব ইনক্রিজ করছে তো দিন, আর অধিকাংশ গ্রামগঞ্জের ছেলে মেয়ে তো, মানে সেটা এখনো ডিসাইড হয়নি। এটা সুপ্রিম কোর্টে আছে, 14 তারিখে হয়তো ডিসাইড হবে কিভাবে হবে। ন্যাচারালি 3-4 মাস পিছিয়ে যাবোই আমরা, কিছু করার নেই আর কি। তো ঠিক আছে, এমনি রিসার্চ বা অন্যান্য কাজগুলো টুকটাক চলছে, থিসিস ভাইবা বা এই সব জিনিসগুলো। হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু এখন এই মুহূর্তে ঠিক বলা যাচ্ছে না, তবে গভর্নমেন্ট প্ল্যান করছে যে সেপ্টেম্বরের মাস থেকে কিছু করে খুলবে আর কি, প্ল্যান করছে এখনো।
Right. আমাদের তো we are making in some opinion we are making a horrendous mistake. We are opening in 2 weeks.
Right.
All students are coming back. I'm going back to teaching. কি করে যে হবে ব্যাপারটা, মাস্ক পরে টিচ করা is going to be quite tricky.
আকি আবার খুলেছে একটু।
And sir, Professor John is here with us.
Right. Let's switch to English. I'm sorry, John.
It's okay.
So no, we have been closed for the summer. So the summer there were no students on campus. I was teaching online, but in the fall, students come back on August 20th, and then classes start August 26th.
Okay.
I'm teaching one face-to-face class, what we call seated class. I'm teaching one full online, and I'm teaching one blended. So I'll still have to go to campus. Kintu my wife, you remember Shati, right? You met her.
Yeah. We met her.
Yeah, so she's a science she's a scientist, so she has been going for the last month almost, with the PPE, because her lab work requires her to be there. You cannot do lab work sitting at home.
Right. It's quite impossible. That's the problem, mostly for the scientists,
So, Dr.
We'll be starting
Mukherjee,
in 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, we'll start.
I was going to
We'll be
ask,
starting in 5 minutes.
okay, Dr. Mukherjee,
Yes, sir.
there are people we might not know here. There are there are two Dr. Mukherjees here. I meant Shumit Mukherjee. Should we go through a quick introduction and
Yes,
know
here I am.
who's who?
Actually, you will be. No, you will be introduced by my colleague Nivedita Shah, who will be comparing the program, and then she will be introducing the other speaker also, and the Honorable Vice Chancellor needs no introduction. Obviously,
Okay.
he speaks his image speaks for itself.
So, Dr. Shohini Mukherjee, are you also in Kolkata?
No, we are both in Kalyani, Mr. Mitro.
I'm in Kalyani. I'm the OSD to the Vice Chancellor.
I see. Okay. And Dr.
Probably we have met earlier, or we have interacted through mail. I think. I suppose.
Of course. For the event in December, I remember communicating with you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon,
Your
sir.
memory is impeccable.
স্যার আমি কিন্তু আপনাকে গুড আফটারনুন বলিনি, এখনো এই বললাম।
Good
ভাইস
afternoon.
চ্যান্সেলর স্যারের সাথে আমার দেখা হয়নি ফর লাস্ট 21 days or some like that, because I was suffering from chicken pox. That's why I was on leave. আর সেই জন্য দেখা হয়নি ওনার সাথে। So
And Dr. Reedy, where are you located?
I am in London.
Okay, perfect. So you have a more reasonable time. It's a little.
Right.
It's okay.
Yeah,
I usually get up. Yeah.
The university is very quiet, so that's why I'm not wearing a face mask.
There we go. Yeah.
And it's 32 degrees.
Oh wow, it's pretty warm. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
এটা কি করছে দেখুন তো। এটা কি হলো?
Somebody is sharing a screen. That's what has happened.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, something has happened. Something has gone wrong. I think somebody is sharing a screen.
Kajori, someone Kajol Datto.
Joel or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it's okay. I think we are back again. Yeah.
I hope it's not me, because I'm not used to the Google system.
Yes.
I've been using Zoom, so
Right. That's what we've been completely. Our university has selected Zoom as the platform, so we're completely in that. But this is pretty good. I did the one with Bortoman. Rajesh Das, you might remember him, Dr. Mukherjee. He was at the December workshop. Did one with him recently.
Yeah, I mean, the Open University in UK is only using Teams, yeah?
Yeah.
Because they're worried about Google bombing.
Well, and there's been some Zoom bombing.
I mean Zoom bombing, sorry. Yeah.
Right.
Zoom bombing.
Should we start? I think it's 5 p.m. I think we can start now. Sir, with your permission, Abi Vice, can I start, sir?
Yes.
শুরু করবো? আচ্ছা।
Sure.
Nivedita, please start.
One by one, they will join.
Good afternoon. We cordially welcome all of you to the one-day international webinar on global multiculturalism organized by the Center for Studies on Bengali Diaspora, University of Kolkata. Now I request Professor Shumik Mukherjee, Director of the Center for Studies on Bengali Diaspora and Head of the Department of Political Science, University of Kolkata, to introduce the theme of today's deliberation.
Thank you, Nivedita. Can everybody hear me? Am I audible to all?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yes.
With the permission of the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the University, I take the liberty of introducing the central theme of today's webinar, Global Multiculturalism. The world today is going through tumultuous times due to the outbreak of the deadly pandemic. And as a result, many of the conventional ideas, theories, concepts, and values are being subjected to radical reassessment and redefinition. Multiculturalism is a concept which is widely debated in contemporary academic discourse. Some time back, Gita Chin wrote a book entitled The Crisis of Multiculturalism in Europe, where she enunciated the point that multiculturalism had encountered a crisis ever since the 1980s. But today, with the outbreak of the pandemic, it is worthwhile to ponder as to whether that crisis has been deepened, whether it has intensified, or is it a new crisis that has gripped the concept. Some time back, a renowned economist who happened to be my teacher,
were destined to be shown the door.
Doors. That means they would be unceremoniously kicked out. Obviously, I'm not sure as to whether this sinister prognostication will have too many takers. And I doubt whether there is any justification to be so pessimistic. But it is an inescapable, indubitable, ineluctable fact that with the outbreak of pandemic, the foreign policy of তুমি জয়েন করছো কেন পাচ্ছ না আমি শুরু করেছি তুমি ক্লিক করো লিংকটা আমি তোমায় অ্যাডমিট করিয়ে নিচ্ছি লিংকটা ক্লিক করো আমি শুরু করে দিয়েছি তুমি করো Sorry, the first speaker, the other speaker of today's webinar is facing some difficulty. She just phoned me. I had to answer the phone. She's trying to join. Now, the point is, the foreign policy of different countries is undergoing radical changes. And this is the point where I think the starting point of today's webinar can be located. That is, will the concept of multiculturalism sustain and retain its validity, its efficacy, its credibility, its legitimacy in the changed circumstances in a kaleidoscopic world? We have two learned speakers with us. The first is Professor Anunna Vitro of Wake Forest University. And then Professor Bhaswati Sarkar, she will certainly be able to join in. Now I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Shankar Kumar Ghosh, to kindly inaugurate the webinar with a few valuable words.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mukherjee, to organize this kind of webinar. And everybody want to say that good day for today, because someone is good evening and someone is a good morning. So good day for everyone. And so it's a time to discuss more webinar throughout the globe, and we are actually going to go for our new normal life.
তুমি জয়েন করতে এখনো পারোনি কেন? কি কি তোমাকে নেটের প্রবলেম?
Excuse me, Dr. Mukherjee, you might want to mute your screen.
মিউট শিখেছেন, আশ্চর্য হয়ে যাচ্ছে।
সুমিতবাবু, আপনি মিউট করুন আপনার
গুগল মিটে ক্লিক করো।
এটা মিউট করুন।
Hello, sir. Sir might be unable to hear because he discharged his earphone.
Can I make a request? Whoever is running the webinar, could you mute out everybody except the speaker? Is it possible to do that?
It is.
Yeah, then let's mute everybody out unless the person is the speaker, unless the person raises a hand to ask a question. Otherwise, it was cutting off when Professor Ghosh was speaking. We could not hear him because there was background noise.
Okay, so everybody is requesting to just mute their microphone initially. During this pandemic session, now we are really, our globe is 6 months and we want to enter the new life, and this life should be normal as much as possible. So we are really going to a new normal life, and that might be
এখন তো শুরু হয়ে লিঙ্ক নিশ্চয়ই পেয়ে গেছেন, এখন ওয়েবিনার শুরু হয়ে গেছে।
সুমিত বাবু, ওয়ান রিকোয়েস্ট, আপনার এটা মিউট করে রাখুন। হ্যাঁ, মিউট করে রাখুন, তারপরে আপনি ফোনগুলো রিসিভ করুন এবং অ্যাডভাইস করুন। হ্যাঁ, তাহলে একটু সুবিধা হবে, ঠিক আছে না? এখন আপনি মিউট করুন আপনার ইয়েটা, তাহলে একটু সুবিধা হবে, আর কিছুই না।
অফ করে দিচ্ছি।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, মিউট করুন, শিওর। হ্যাঁ, দ্যাটস ফাইন। তো দ্যাট the new area that we want to exercise ourselves to get the betterment of our new life. And all of you know that this diaspora or multiculturalism is a similar fine morning that we can get the interchange to each other. So if we are waiting for vaccine, for this present pandemic, it is like a one kind of multiculturalism, in my opinion. Somebody is preparing the vaccine from Oxford, and we want to take these vaccines in Kolani, or we want to take the vaccine from Harvard or North Carolina, whatever it may be, and in JNU. So that is also, in point of view, that is one kind of multiculturalism, because so these diaspora or one thing to another area, the culture can be transferred to each other and mix up this culture so that we can get able to new dimension of this culturalism. So everything we have to get the new innovative part which might be helpful for us, for the younger generation. Now the big challenge is how we can effort ourselves to get down the education system in the global perspective. Online we can make and views the different kind of part, but what about the others, like a practical and research oriented, where there is a lots of time you have to spend into the laboratory. Really, in that angle, last 6 months, we are really a back foot. We don't know how much time we want to spend in the forward. So this kind of discussion is necessary every time. I request everybody to make the person to come over here we can enjoy, we can discuss, and Kolkata University is regularly doing such kind of webinar from the different corner, from the expert from the like a very good expert from JNU and Work Forest in North Carolina and from the London. So that might be give our very good message. And now the platform is like a Google platform or Zoom platform, whatever the platform, they are enriching themselves in such a way that we can able to get this kind in YouTube and other way. So this new normal is coming in such a way. So today the program, my feeling will be the excellent, because I know Professor Mitro, who came our university last time, and we discussed lots of collaboration and other place so that we can able to make the globalization in such a way. So this is the one kind of I can say that this is the one kind of globalization, or make the our education system in such a way that we want to able to use our online program. With these few words, I again happy to introduce all the experts and viewers, those who are taking this today's smell of this multiculturalism. So I request Professor Mukherjee to get on the part to nicely organize so that it will be helpful. With these few words, I thanks once more. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words. Now, I think our second speaker, Professor Bhashwati Shwakan, has also joined. Bhashwati,
the first speaker of our today's one-day international seminar is Professor Anunna Vitro. Professor Anunna Vitro is a professor of communication at Wake Forest University. His research and teaching interests include media, technology, culture, data collection, data management, and issues surrounding Indian culture. He is credited with the invention of the idea of nerves, and his principal research, writing, and practical concerns are in the ways in which technology is constantly reshaping our everyday life practices, and calling into the question how we live our life within a constantly changing global space. He was educated at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, Wake Forest University, and the University of Illinois. He is the owner of independent research agency called Management Learning Laboratories that specializes in applying technology to the collection, management, and visualization of data. Now, I would like to invite Professor Anunna Vitro to share his insightful views with us. Please, Professor Mitro. Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to set down some ground rules of how we do this. Basically, it seems like everybody is muted out right now, which is a good thing. My presentations are typically a little interactive, so I like to get questions from my audience as we go. So the way I'll play this is I'll speak for a little bit of time. I will pause, invite questions. If you can unmute yourself at that point and ask a question, that would be great. I can hear you. I will not be able to check the chat messages while I'm speaking. It becomes a little inconvenient for me, but if somebody sees a chat question, one of you can simply ask that question. So that's basically how I'll do that. If one of you can acknowledge that you get what I'm saying, then I will continue. Is that fair? Is that a fine way? Is that okay to do it in that fashion? A fingers up would be, I see John shaking his head, that seems reasonable. So yes, I can see you guys mostly. And
Professor Mitro, this question answer session will be held after the two presentations have been made. We'll have an overall question answer session. So you can start. And I think Bhashwati, you have joined, have you? I think Bhashwati Sarkar has joined us. The second speaker. Bhashwati, have you joined? I think she has.
Okay.
Yes,
Fair
yes,
enough.
okay, I think she can't hear me, I think.
Okay.
Okay,
So let's get started. And again, well, I can see one person I know, another person I know who's joined. That is Dr. Rajesh has a question as I'm going through. Just unmute yourself and quickly ask the question, and I'll try and address that. Does that sound reasonable, Rajesh? If you can give me a thumbs up.
Yes, sir.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Let's get started. Good afternoon and good morning. Well, last question. How much time have you allotted for each speaker? I should have come a little better prepared with that information, but what is the time that you're offering to each speaker? Okay, didn't hear any response to that. I'll assume about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll see. I can keep talking. Well, thank you, first of all, to everybody, particularly Dr. Mukherjee, Dr. Ghosh, for organizing this webinar and inviting me to participate in it. It's an honor, a privilege, and all of these terms are kind of important in today's world. And I'm happy to join. To give you a little sense of context, I'm sitting, as I have been, literally from about March when I got back from Kolkata. I've been sitting in my basement mostly because we have 3 members in our home. My son, thankfully, he is with us. He lives in Los Angeles, but he came out in time. And my wife, who's also a professor at Wake Forest, and we have separated our spaces. And I say this to contextualize what globalization is, what the diasporic experience is in the under the umbrella of what Professor Ghosh reminded us very importantly, that we are in a new normal. That is an interesting term, and it's the term that has become quite popular in describing our condition. But let me take you back in history. August 6th and August 9th are 2 days infamous in history, and this is why it becomes interactive. Does anybody remember what happened about 75 years ago that changed the world permanently? That happened on August 6th and August 9th? You can jump in, you can unmute yourself and answer the question. If anybody knows what happened 75 years ago, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of this event. Okay, just to give you a sense of history here, on August 6th and August 9th, the United States dropped the 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war came to an end. Perhaps for our generation, and by our I mean folks like Dr. Ghosh, John, just by looks, we're probably in the same age group. In our generation, we have not had a global event like what we are facing today with the coronavirus. Our parents' generation lived through 1 war. Our grandparents' generation lived through 2 wars. And each one of these were moments of interruption in the global system. The Second World War was perhaps one of the most important historical moments of interruption that we have ever experienced in every way, political, economic, cultural. And I say that because we are so enamored and so taken by this term globalization that we tend to forget our historical moment in the 1940s when the war was over. Take yourself back if you can, remember your history a little bit. Take yourself back and you remember Western Europe was devastated after the war, right? All the infrastructure was gone. There was one country that was not touched by the war. People often forget this. The mainland of the United States was never, ever touched by the war. Not a single bomb actually fell on the United States that created any kind of interruption in the infrastructure of the US. Why is that important? Surely, 6th of December 1941 is when Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. That was an attack on the United States, not on the mainland, no, nevertheless. Why is that important? Because after the war, we got accustomed to a new term called Americanization. If you look at what happened in Europe, particularly in the United States, because of the affinity, United Kingdom, because of the affinity between the US and UK faced something that many scholars, many cultural scholars responded to negatively, was the process of Americanization. So that interruption created Americanization, and it created a second thing. It created a new narrative for the world. All of a sudden, the world was plunged into the Cold War. And the Cold War resulted in the creation of two worlds, the so-called Soviet bloc under the Warsaw Pact, and the North American bloc, or the Western world, the democratic world, which was under the, which eventually becomes NATO, right? So we divided the world up in very precise terms, and we entered the Cold War. No doubt in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, things changed again. So we are at a moment of inflection, historical, economic inflection, where we are basically saying, going back to Professor Ghosh's language, a new normal. What is this new normal, and what does this mean for people like me sitting in a basement in North Carolina of Indian origin, intimately tied to India, intimately tied to Kolkata? For the past, this is the first time ever since my mother died about 6 years ago, I have not been at home, and I use that term intentionally, the idea of home. I have not been home for more than 5 months. I left Kolkata right around the early part of March, right before the lockdown happened in India, and I have not been able to go back. It is only on Friday of last week that the government of India finally said that a US citizen, which I am, I travel under a US passport, with an OCI card is now permitted to come to India. Permitted, in a very interesting word. What am I? And you asked about diaspora, and Professor Mukherjee runs the Center for Bengali Diaspora at Kolkata University. I am a Bengali. Fundamentally, I am a Bengali. That's what defines me. Even today, I watch Hoichoi on my television, and I'm up to date with the most recent series. By the way, guys, have you all watched the series called Hello on Hoichoi? Shushmita Sen. It's quite an interesting show, and I bring that in because it shows what globalization is. Things that can be shown on over-the-top and streaming media. I couldn't even imagine that such a story would actually become popular. I don't want to give away the story. Has anybody watched this series, by the way? It is related to the idea of globalization. It's called Hello on the network called Hoichoi, which is available online. This is interesting. Nobody's saying anything. Even sitting in Kolkata, you might not be watching this, but here in Winston-Salem, I'm watching it in my basement. And why am I watching it? Point of inflection. Because of the virus. I would not have thought of finding the time to watch these shows because life would have been busy. All of a sudden, life has been interrupted. People are stuck at home. All the evidence starts to show that from the media perspective, we have globalized ourselves. Look at what has happened with the way in movies are moving. And I am a media person, so I'll eventually take it to media. Look at the way in which movies are going on. All movie theaters are shut literally across the world. I cannot think of a single place where you can go into the movie theater, buy popcorn, and sit down and watch a movie. So where do we go? We go to the other global space, which has been defined by the network. And the network brings us Hoichoi in Winston-Salem, and it brings you Netflix in Kolkata. So the globalization that was a proto-globalization, if you would, that was happening has been accelerated by this. There are things that are going on because of the virus and the new normal that would have been unimaginable or would not even have been considered as a part of everyday life. And this does not have to be the negative things. Without a doubt, it's a horrendous moment in human history. You know, as I said before, nothing like this has ever happened to our generation. We did not see the war. We saw small conflicts. We saw Vietnam. We saw people sitting in India. I well remember 1971 when we went into the Bangladesh war. Those were important and very, very decisive conflicts, but nobody has seen anything like this before. And because of this, there are changes happening in the diasporic world, particularly for the Indian diaspora in the United States, that would not have been imagined, or would have been imagined, but would not have been accessed. I'll give you some examples. And I usually, those of you who have attended these webinars before, you know, I rely on examples, real life, guys. This is not about theory. This is what's happening to us. I'll give you one example. Other than this webinar I'm sitting in the last 5 months, I've interacted more with my colleagues in India, such as Professor Dash that I mentioned, such as Professor Mukherjee who's running this, more than I would have had if there was no virus. You know, we have communicated by WhatsApp, we have exchanged emails. I've done this. This is a product of this pandemic. The other thing that has happened, and maybe some of you can relate to this, even sitting in Kolkata, I have met with my family, my extended family, more than I have met with them ever before. Every Sunday afternoon, we get on Zoom and family members, we are talking to each other. We come to know each other. Talk about diaspora. It doesn't matter at this moment whether I'm in my basement or I'm in Kolkata. You guys are stuck at your homes, just as I'm stuck at my home, and home doesn't matter anymore, because as long as this technology exists, we are globalized. So in many ways, at a very personal level, at a very interpersonal level, this pandemic has brought people together. So my goal is not necessarily to dwell on the negative. Without a doubt, there is a lot of negatives. Without a doubt, we have complete uncertainty about where we are going. Professor Ghosh mentions, very importantly, 2 vital pieces of information. The vaccine. Let's think about the vaccine. This is a global effort. Look at the one that's coming out of Oxford. Oxford says that they're going to create a vaccine that Mr. Poonawalla out of Serum Institute in Pune says he will make it available to people in India for 1,000 rupees. That's an affordable vaccine. Today, if I go out to a local clinic to get myself tested for COVID in the United States, in North Carolina, it's $179. $179 is what? At 70 pop for $1, that's about the 14,000 rupees. 14,000 rupees is 1,000 rupees for a vaccine. But let's think about that vaccine for a second. Dr. Ghosh rightly said that there's one coming out of Oxford, there's one coming out of Harvard. This is a global effort, because this is a global, and I use the metaphor of war. And I use the metaphor of war for a very interesting reason. A war, even the Second World War, which had devastating consequences, as I said earlier, in Western Europe, the Second World War touched everybody's lives. People lost family members, people got bombed, people were driven into the subway in London day after day, night after night, as the battle of as the Luftwaffe bombs London. The horrendous genocide of Jews, right? That's what the war brought us. But yet there were people untouched. Yet there were a lot of people in the world who were untouched by that war. Consider, and again, I don't remember who said this, Dr. Mukherjee must have said this just now. Consider the villager outside of Medinipur in West Bengal who did not have any effect of the war. Perhaps some views of the war from whatever mechanism, and by war I mean the Second World War. But this is a different war. This is a globalized war, because no one, literally no one, is immune. I am making my plans right now. As I just said earlier, the government of India just released their papers on Friday of last week, saying I can now go to India, and I am yearning to go. I'm waiting to make my trip to Kolkata, hopefully within the next month. But in the entire travel, and my travel will be from New York to Delhi, I have no idea what is going on in Delhi right now, how many days they'll quarantine me, or if they will quarantine me. But at every moment during that journey, I will be facing the enemy, if you use that metaphor for war. There's not a place where you can be safe. And this is a different war also because you talk about the new normal, the new world that will emerge. There is no guarantee that this new world will emerge. Let's take a listen, consider why there is a lack of guarantee. And I go to science, and Dr. Ghosh is a scientist, he'll probably recognize this very well. We talk about the vaccine. We also talk about a virus that mutates at a pace that is so rapid that we have no guarantee that the vaccine that we invent and that we start applying perhaps even as early as the winter of this year will actually work. Who knows? You know, we might actually make vaccine after vaccine, and we will know that we have to live with this. And that comes to a point where we said many years ago, and again, I go back to American history, although this is a history that I don't remember. I was not in the United States at that time. I was growing up in India. But we have at least John in our group who might remember this from European history. Americans were told in the 1960s, hide under a table when a nuclear bomb goes off. I see John's confirmation by the shake of the head. Did they say that to you in England as well? I suppose, no, they did not. Well, you guys are a little smarter than us. But well, that's very well evident right now with our fearless leader. I can say this, right? Is this being recorded? Because I might not get very anti-Trump momentarily. I hope that does not offend others. And even if it does, I don't really care. At this point, we were told, Americans were told, hide under a desk when the bomb goes off. You'll be obliterated, but you'll be obliterated under a desk, right? What do we do now? Our option is simple. And the simple option is not something Americans have gotten it, right? Wear the stupid mask. If you wear that mask, look at Dr. Mukherjee, the only person wearing the mask because he's in a public space. But the gentleman behind him is not wearing the mask, which is fine because he's further away right now. You know, wear the mask and keep social distance. This will beat this darn thing. There is a way out of this war. Might not be the vaccine immediately, but there is a way. But here's why globalization comes back. Because globalization fundamentally, if you go back, now you stop, go back to the theory. Globalization fundamentally has a presumption which has never been articulated very well or never been spoken out very well, is a presumption of collective good. What I do in my basement in North Carolina has an effect like never before in what happens in a village in Murshidabad. This is because if I am careless, if I don't wear my mask, if I don't take the precautions, and I come across somebody who's traveling, that person will take it there. This is how this darn thing spread. We can blame China quite a bit about it, and we will for the rest of our lived lives. I think China has now become a pariah, and in many ways they probably should be. Well, why the heck did it spread to Italy? Stop and think about how did suddenly it goes to Italy more than UK, more than the United States. Look at the global economy, all right? Where was China investing? Where were these Chinese engineers and the people from China coming in? Milan, Northern Italy. It didn't go to Southern Italy that quickly. It started in North Italy. Globalization at its best. Globalization requires, and we have never thought about this before, requires the common good. And that is what is getting lost. So actually it's a loss more than a gain. We are gaining at an interpersonal level, but we are losing at an international level. Somebody like the President of the United States turns around and says, I'm going to leave the WHO. Why? Because the WHO says things that goes against his political agenda, right? The seeds were already there. This is something that was a catalyst to make that happen. Is it true today that, and John, you can jump in and help me with this, Brexit. How has Brexit impacted what is going on with the virus? Well, perhaps one could make an argument that the move by UK to move out of the European Union perhaps has reduced certain amount of people moving. That may be a good thing for the moment right now. But the fact remains, globalization assumed common good for the global system, but this is now giving an opportunity to actually reverse that, which brings me to the idea of the travel bubbles. Somebody is actually sharing a screen, which is fine with me, but I have suddenly lost view of the people in the room. That's okay. I don't know who's sharing the screen or doing a presentation, but anyway. So what we basically, the argument that I'm making is this becomes an excuse to reverse globalization by making the claim that, look, if we remain contained in our basements, in our homes, in our cities, in our countries, this thing will go away. But that is not necessarily the solution that I would think. If you think about the collective good, and we know the science tells us, and by the science I mean the biological sciences, the science tells us certain things. And if we can do those little small things, we don't have to give up globalization. We don't have to give up the interconnection between nations and draw ourselves into our countries or into our spaces. So it's really a tussle right now, whether to make the argument that, look, we are becoming global and therefore the virus is bad, or to say we are already global and we have the responsibility towards the other human being, no longer just the American in North Carolina, or no longer just the British in Leicester. Look at Leicester. Leicester was a great example of what happened just a few weeks ago. Leicester went back into a lockdown because, as my good friend who lives in Leicester, teaches at the University of Leicester, is a physician, said people were not following basic rules. Why do people follow or not follow basic rules? This has become a question that is really worthy of asking. Is it related to globalization, or is it related to a sense of entitlement that, look, I don't have to do this because I am above this, and this is the American problem. What we have here, and I'm going to turn this to the United States for a little bit, what we have here now is a situation it is my right not to follow the global rules that would help the rest of the world. There are encounters that are going on in grocery stores. I'll give you a story. And I've spoken about this. Dr. Rajesh Dash will remember this from the other webinar that happened some times ago. There's a situation where I was in a grocery store, supermarket. I am standing behind a middle-aged white lady, and she's not wearing a mask. And the checkout clerk, the person who's actually checking us out and taking the, scanning the items, very politely asks the lady that, ma'am, you have to wear a mask. And this woman goes into a rant about how it is her right to freedom, right to individuality. Globalization takes a toss at that moment. Right to individuality, that she need not wear a mask. And my response, I got incredibly annoyed. And here's where it becomes really interesting. This is a white woman. I am a brown man in a world of Trump, where anything other than white is suspicious to many white people. And here I am, a middle-aged brown man, who tells her that, look, ma'am, you might have a right to your freedom of wearing a mask or not, but darn it, I have a right to live. You are encroaching on my right to live by not wearing that mask. It got a little nasty. She left, I left, but that's life. That's where globalization fails. Globalization requires a global attitude. Everybody in this room, I would argue, might have a global attitude, but stop and think for a second. Do you really care about what the heck is going on in Malaysia or in Thailand? I'm sticking to Asia. And in other parts of Asia as to your behavior? Yeah, we have stopped international flights, we have stopped all of that, but nature finds a way. That famous line from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way. And nature will find a way unless we work with nature. Nature is telling us, look, guys, we can do this. Even yesterday, even after Trump goes out and does all his weird things about, he is a guy who comes out and says, It is what it is. Let them die is the enthymeme in that. If you all remember rhetoric, enthymeme is what you don't say, but the argument is presented anyhow. All right. It is what it is. Really? It is what it is. And we can't do a little thing or few things that reminds us that this is a global problem with individual responsibility. And that's where I think the real crux of the problem is. And the more I've thought about it, and I'm thinking about it, I'm writing about it, the crux is to think globally as an individual is an incredibly difficult task. It is very difficult to imagine what life is like outside of my, outside of my basement. It is very difficult to think what life is like outside of wherever you are. But this is a thing that is truly global. Talk about, and I did want to say a word, and then I'll shut up and perhaps take a few questions. Dr. Mukherjee's efforts in creating the global diaspora, or the diasporic Bengalis. Diasporic Bengalis have suddenly come together because they realized, geez, we have nothing else to do. Might as well hang with other Bengalis. I am spending a heck of a lot of time. I went to school in Kolkata. I spent my entire life until the age of 19 in Kolkata, then moved on to Kharagpur to get my education at IIT. So I've been in West Bengal until I eventually moved to the United States, or came to the United States, without necessarily the assumption of moving, but it ended up that I've been here for 35 years. But the diasporic Bengalis have not gotten together as frequently as they have. Thank God, Zoom and Google and whatever else that you're using. I'm speaking to my friends in Calcutta Boys School or from Calcutta Boys School. These are people who are old. I mean, we look at each other and say, geez, how did we get so old? But the thing is, all of a sudden we're looking at each other, gray hair, and we're talking in Bangla. People spread out. They remember Calcutta Boys School, primarily back in the 60s and 70s, was a middle-class Bengali school. I don't know what it is today. It might have become more privileged, but it was. My parents were middle class, government servant, and my father could afford to send me to Calcutta Boys School. And these are mostly Bengali boys. And we suddenly realized, we are talking in Bangla. This is amazing. I haven't spoken in Bangla as much as other than with my family as I have over this COVID period. I'm talking to my friends from IIT Kharagpur. Again, a lot of Bengalis. The Bengali diaspora is widespread, and this has brought us together. So I came into this webinar, I thought about it, and I must thank, a word of thanks to Rajesh, because Rajesh and I had a little chat yesterday. I was thinking, what do I talk about? How do I present this? This doom and gloom, and life is coming to an end. Everything's over. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe this is an inflection. This is an opportunity. The Western world got this opportunity after the war. Whatever happened after the war, many of the things, you look at England. England is a prime example. England recovered from the war. You can't even, you go to London today. Would you imagine the city was devastated by bombs? You go to Dresden, which used to be in Eastern Europe or East Germany. I was there after the unification. And you walk by and you walk around in Dresden and you realize this is one of the cities that had the largest amount of Allied bombings. Now look at where they are today. It can be done. We have to consider the opportunities that this has provided, which is maybe very, it might sound rather heartless to say when 5 million in the United States and Donald Trump's promise to be America first has been fulfilled. We are number one in the infections. We are number one in deaths. That's a horrendous moment. But unless we find these opportunities, and these opportunities are not necessarily scientific, these are opportunities for personal growth, for communal growth, for realizing that we are individuals in a global world. I don't know how long I've been speaking. I didn't keep track. I think I've been going longer than people want to listen to me. So I'm going to shut up. And if you want to offer some quick questions, I'd be happy to do that. And then we can have a longer Q&A later after this. So as I said, I'm going to pause and questions, or I will turn it back over to Dr. Mukherjee.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for a superlative presentation.
Can you hear me, sir?
Of course I can. Yes, I can.
Yes. Thank you for a superlative presentation. As per our program schedule, I think we'll now go over to the next speaker who has fortunately joined us. There she is, Bhashwati Sarkar, and let her make her presentation first, and then we shall take all the questions together. Okay. Now Nivedita Shaha will introduce Professor Bhashwati Sarkar. Nivedita Shaha. No, let Bhashwati be. Yes, Nivedita, you are. Please introduce Bhashwati. Yes, there you are.
Okay. Today's second speaker is Professor Bhashwati Sarkar. Dr. Bhashwati Sarkar is a professor at the Center for European Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is a political scientist by training. Dr. Sarkar graduated from Presidency College, Kolkata, and completed her master's and PhD from JNU. Her research interests are ethnicity, nation, nationalism, democracy, democratic transition and consolidation, citizenship, immigration, integration, multiculturalism, minority rights, secularism, and persistence of religion, European integration and European identity. She looks at Europe, focusing particularly on Central and Eastern Europe and the Nordics. She has presented and published a number of papers around these themes. Her latest publications are 2 edited volumes, India and the Nordics in a Changing World, which was published in 2018, and Hope Unlimited, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which was published in 2016. Now I request Professor Bhashwati Sarkar to share her insightful views with us. Please, Professor Sarkar, please do so.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Bhashwati.
Oh,
please start.
Yes.
Very good evening to all of you, and good morning, I think, to Professor Mitro. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee and Professor Ghosh. I was asked by Professor Mukherjee to talk about multiculturalism and essentially to look at Europe and to look at how multiculturalism has sort of panned out in Europe. So I think I'll keep to that. And I think what Professor Mitro was talking about was about globalization and the COVID challenge and the kind of opportunities and that the opportunity which he talked of in terms of connectivity, technology being used, and the challenge of actually battling the disease, and also in terms of looking at our own individual responsibilities, because they connect very critically in a global world. So I think something of that sort was being argued by Professor Mitro, and I have a few questions for him, which I'll come to later. Regarding my presentation, essentially I want to look at what is happening in Europe in terms of living with diversity, living with its multicultural identity. The first thing which comes to my mind is, why do we look at Europe in any case? We in India are very comfortable in terms of looking at our multicultural diversity. We understand that this is something of very critical significance to our own identity, our own multicultural identity. So we have lived with the multicultural identity for long. This is something which sort of defines us when we look at us as Indians. It could also be looked at as our sort of USP, unique selling point, right? That it's something very important that we have achieved in terms of dealing with our diversity, the sheer diversity in terms of, say, language, ethnicity, religion, all of it, right? And especially coming out from a colonial past. So why do we look at Europe in any case? Now, very recently, a few days back, July 15th, it was the European Union and India Virtual Summit. This was the virtual summit which happened as I said, a few days back. And in this virtual summit, obviously there were good things which were said in terms of joint action plan, etc., with the European Union. But what I want to also draw your attention to is that this very January 2020, right? January 2020, in the European Parliament, which is one of the, which is actually the only sort of elected body of the European Union institutions. It is elected by its citizens. So this elected parliament, the new parliament, in January 2020 was actually thinking or contemplating of bringing about 6 resolutions against India, or rather reflecting on India's development in terms of the things which have happened over a period of time. So the resolutions were basically on which did not go through, in the sense they were postponed, but those resolutions were related to our CAA, NRC, and Kashmir. So 3 very critical issues so far as India is concerned, and India has been trying to explain and project its own understanding of why these things are the way they are. But on these 3 issues, as I said, this parliament, this European Parliament, was actually going to pass resolutions, right, censoring it in some sense, that these are things which go against human rights. Now, this brings me to the point that if you're looking at the European Union per se, one of the important, or one of the critical things which defines it, or the way it wants it to be also to be defined, is that it is an institution which is governed by norms, values, human rights, minority rights, etc. Right? So European Union is, both in its internal and external projection, is talking about questions of rights, question of democracy. So democracy promotion, rule of law, all of these are very important when we are looking at European Union as an integration project. If you remember, a few years back, 2004, when the Big Bang enlargement happened, when the Central European countries were actually in the post-transition period, became a member of the European Union, at that point of time, you had the Copenhagen Criteria, which was formulated, which essentially was talking about all of these things, that you need to get certain things right before you are ready for membership. So if you, just like you had to get your economy right, which means you had to get have a thriving market economy, or you have to have the parameters which move you towards the market economy in place. You also had the questions regarding to democracy, which they had to fulfill. So democracy, minority rights, again, rule of law, this became a big sort of defining issues in terms of whether membership could be achieved or not. So what I'm basically trying to say is that when we look at Europe, we see that Europe is also in one sense European Union, because there are 27 now member states which are part of this union. We can debate about how strong this union is and all the crises that it has seen over the last few years, but nevertheless it's very much there as an actor, and as an actor we see that the European Union values norms, it values values, it values democracy, it values human rights, etc. So therefore it's also important to see is how does it fare, like if we look at Europe, how does it fare when we try to look at it from outside and measure it in terms of dealing with questions of these norms being put in place, etc. So if we look at Europe and the European states, what I would submit is that what one can see is that there is a kind of a diversity which is a post Second World War diversity, which was which was a result of the immigrant movement that happened in the post Second World War period. Professor Mitro had mentioned about the devastation of the war, right, where Europe, when it was coming out of this devastation, needed extra hands. It needed extra hands to fight the war. It needed extra hands post the war. So you see the movement of immigrants into Europe from various parts, and especially if you're looking at some of the countries, like for instance UK, if you're looking at Netherlands, if you're looking at France, essentially there were movements from the colonies, right? So the colonies became sort of the, areas from where the people were outsourced, so to say, if one can put it that way, who were coming into these European countries. So and this in one sense introduced, I would say, a kind of diversity which Europe had earlier not known. So it doesn't mean that Europe was not diverse earlier. So Europe was diverse in many ways. So if you look at it in terms of the nation states themselves, the linguistic differences, cultural differences, of course they were there. In UK, for instance, if you just pick up UK as an instance, you can see that obviously it had these constituent parts, right? Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England. So all of that made UK what UK is. So there were differences even there. If you look at Spain, we heard very recently about the Catalan referendum, just like we had heard about the Scottish referendum. So the Catalans and the Basques in Spain different, and also they were basically looking for their own rights vis-a-vis the Spanish central government. So one is not arguing that there was no diversity in Europe prior to immigrants, prior to this kind of post-Second World War immigration. But what had happened in the post-Second World War period is people who were coming to Europe were very different in terms of, say, their culture, and also in terms of what was actually looked at as colored migration. So if you look at, for instance, the debates in the UK in terms of people who were coming in, there was always this kind of apprehension about this colored migration. So you needed people, you also wanted to have people moving in, because the initial, if you look at for instance UK, the first law actually in one sense, 1948 nationality law, was basically allowing everybody who was subjects in the various Commonwealth countries, they had a kind of a legitimacy to come into the UK. So on the one hand, you see that there is this idea that of the people who are outside and who are British subjects, that they have some kind of legitimacy vis-a-vis the mainland. You also need people to work, so you need people in. But at the same time, you're really apprehensive about the kind of heterogeneity, the kind of cultural difference that that this kind of colored migration initiates, or it has long-term implications. So what one sees is that in all of these countries, whether we look at France, whether we look at Netherlands, whether we look at UK, there is this colored migration which happens from the colonies, which is in some sense but differently managed, definitely differently managed. For instance, in the UK, when there were problems in terms of how people related to each other, so people came there to work, right? People came there to work, but they found that the level of acceptance of this of the society, so far as they were concerned, because of the fact of who they were, was not really an easy acceptance. So you would find that when people went to work, and if you were a colored person, you would find that people who were white did not want to sit next to you. They did not want to use the same cafes. They did not want to use the same washrooms. So when we talk about cultural encounters and the countries becoming, or these states becoming multicultural, which means multicultural right now I'm talking in terms of a fact. So factually, in terms of people moving in from different parts of the colonies, it's becoming multicultural and heterogeneous. And then these states needed to respond to this heterogeneity, because, as I said, when you have less acceptance, if you say, in the society, then what does the state do? You find in very early in the UK race riots. And then that sends out signals that you really need to do and step in and do something to sort of tackle this kind of tensions and conflicts in society. So at the one level, what one would see is that the society is becoming multicultural as a result of immigration, and then required responses from the state as to how do you deal with this multicultural, this kind of a multicultural identity, right? What do you do with this kind of a multicultural society? Now, if you look at the theoretical understanding, then what you see is that the multiculturalists were basically because they were basically first looking at the limitations of a liberal democratic framework. So a liberal democratic framework did certain, they were appreciating what the liberal democratic framework had done in terms of rights, because essentially when we are talking in terms of societies and how people live in societies, how people manage differences, how states manage their differences, essentially the argument would be, and my understanding would be, that yes, you are talking in terms of social cohesion. You want people to bond together, you want people to live together, but you also want to create that cohesion on the basis of equality and justice, because unless you do that, that cohesion will tend to be fragile. So if one understands that, then what the multiculturalists were basically arguing by looking at the liberal democratic framework is that what the liberal democracy had done over a period of time was, yes, it had done wonders in terms of getting more and more people into the more and more people to actually enjoy the basket of rights that a liberal democratic state offers. So, and how does it do that? It does it through the instrument of citizenship. So you have citizenship in a liberal democratic state. You are a citizen, and because you are a citizen, you have A, B, C, D rights, and and all those rights you enjoy equally. So all who are citizens, irrespective, and this is important, irrespective of who they are in terms of their gender, in terms of their, say, property, in terms of their educational background, whatever be in terms of their, say, ethnicity, religion, whatever be it, that package or that baggage does not really interfere with your exercising or with your enjoying that basket of rights which the liberal democratic state was offering, right? So that is something which was positive, which had happened. Again, if you look at how democracy initially was, if you're looking at voting rights, only property people allowed to vote, or women not a part of this universal franchise for very many years, right? So everything had to be fought for. So that, while the multiculturalists in one sense were appreciating that fight in terms of reaching a level where you come to a point where everybody is enjoying same kind of rights or a same basket of rights, they then now are arguing, or they go on to argue, and that this is also based on that on a kind of an understanding of a nation state which is homogeneous, right? A kind of a homogeneous nation state understanding where the same basket of rights actually suffice in terms of creating levels or creating equality. What the multiculturalists were now drawing attention to, given the fact that states and societies had become multicultural as a result of this post-war immigration, and again there are differences in that which I will come to in a minute, but what they were essentially arguing is that you now need to actually look beyond this what the liberal democratic framework was offering, and they basically were arguing that you actually see that what is looked at in the liberal democratic framework as a neutral state, that the state is neutral, and this neutral state has a basket of rights which it gives everybody to enjoy equally. So they're basically questioning that and saying that this state is not really culture neutral. The state is actually a state of the majority culture. It actually sort of upholds the majority culture in very many ways, and therefore what it does is that it sort of marginalizes minority cultures, be it of the indigenous communities, be it of the immigrants. So within the multiculturalists, again, there are differences in terms of how they understand what would be the rights of this immigrant group. For instance, if you're looking at Will Kimleka, he basically argues in terms of divides the question of this diversity in terms of national minorities and immigrant groups. And for him, the national minorities, who are actually the group which is basically already in the state, which is otherwise this homogeneous state, but they're as a part of the state because of certain historical reasons. So they're much more like a nation, like the majority nation, and therefore they have a legitimacy to enjoy certain rights which go beyond the basket that is given. So which means that he's basically then arguing for that they should have some kind of self-governing rights, or some kind of autonomy of how they govern their, cultural and linguistic world, and also in terms of, in terms of, say, for instance, land rights, whether others can buy land in there. So all of these are kind of rights which are then being argued for as group rights, which this national minorities actually are eligible, or they are the ones who need to enjoy that if the state is to be just and create real equality. On the other hand, Kimlika, when he talks about the immigrant groups, he talks about immigrant groups as people, and here I think Professor Mitra can come in terms of people who have left their original homelands. And they left their original homelands because of their own, out of their own volition. They were looking for opportunities, better life. So whatever be the reason, it was because they wanted to leave their original homelands. They have come to this new homeland, and therefore, in this new society, which is the whole society, they need to sort of integrate. So for them, it's not that you can actually claim the kind of rights which the national minorities can claim of, given the importance of culture. So here you can see that while the multiculturalists on the one hand are saying that the culture is important, and this is something maybe I should have mentioned earlier, that essentially they're also, the multiculturalists are arguing that the liberal democratic understanding of the individual is as an atomized individual. So individual is somebody who is, his group affiliations, his group characteristics, where he comes from really doesn't matter when you're looking at him as a bearer of rights. So if you're looking at the liberal democratic framework, you're essentially looking at individuals who enjoy these rights, and they're defining or how they're defined is that they can exercise choice, they have autonomy, and they can exercise choice, right? And when you're looking at if you're looking at people who are coming from outside, they have in one sense, which means the immigrant groups, they have exercised one choice in coming in, and Kimlika is arguing that now therefore it is their duty to actually integrate. So this is something some of the multiculturalists, as I said, are arguing. For instance, others like Parekh, Bhikkhu Parekh is another very well-known scholar who is talking about multiculturalism, and he's done a lot of work on multiculturalism in terms of in the context of UK, and bringing many actually contentious issues to the fore, which became actually contentious. So Bhikkhu Parekh, again, he's talking that this is very difficult to understand, that if culture is important, if you say that individuals are culturally embedded, right, and we need, that is what the multiculturalist take is, and that is what is the multiculturalist in one sense value addition is. So you liberal democratic states, a liberal democratic framework talking about individuals, multiculturalists drawing attention to the fact that they are not atomized individuals, they come from various groups, and those cultural groups are important in terms of the worldviews that they have, in terms of the associations that they make. It both gives them opportunity, it may also limit them, given under the conditions that if that cultural group is not does not have adequate respect, adequate recognition in the public realm, then it is difficult for those individuals to just exercise sort of those citizenship rights and reach a level of equality. So basically what the multiculturalists were arguing was that you need to understand the importance of culture when we are looking at individuals, importance of groups, and importance of, because those cultural groups are important for the individuals. So just giving individual rights is not sufficient. You also need to give group rights. So those cultural groups need to get certain rights. So one which Kimlika was talking of in terms of national minorities, but even the immigrant groups need to have certain kinds of, their groups need certain kind of rights to sort of deal with this liberal democratic state, which the liberal democratic framework claims to be neutral, but the multiculturalist would argue that it is not culture neutral. It holds up, or it upholds the majority culture. And one of the very common examples which is given is, for instance, that in most of these European states, Sunday being the holiday, because Sunday is the day when you actually, if people went to church. So that is how it is determined. So on the one hand, you may talk about secularism, etc., but you see that the religion sort of seeps into the cultural realm, right? So the state upholds certain a kind of the importance of the majority culture. It may do it subtly, it may not be apparent, you may take it as something which is there, but essentially the multiculturalists were therefore trying to argue that you need to therefore talk about these other cultural groups which have now, which has now, in their understanding, made the space, this states, what we were talking about as homogeneous spaces, into heterogeneous spaces, and that is something which needs to be recognized. So what the very common way of putting out the multiculturalist argument is the politics of recognizing that these groups are important and that these groups need to be given certain kind of rights apart from the individual rights that the liberal democrats are talking about. So essentially what therefore one we can see is that if this is the multiculturalist argument, what do we see in terms of, in a post Second World War period, when these states become more and more, open to immigration, or when they need immigration, when they, till about the 70s, you see this immigration continues. It is only after the 70s that you see that after the recession, you find that there are stoppages at almost in all of these states, more regulated kind of movement, and the avenue open, which was open, was more of family reunification, right? But what kind of policies were put in place by these various states in terms of, did they reflect the multicultural concerns? Did they put in any kind of policies which reflected the multicultural concern? That is something for us to see in the next 2-3 minutes, maybe. I don't know how much time do I have.
You go on.
Okay, so if we try to look at the policies, what we see is essentially, if you're looking at the various states, and here again France would be a different example, because if you're trying to look at some of these states, for instance UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, for instance, Germany again had its immigrant population coming in the post Second World War period through labor contracts signed with various countries. So it has, for instance, a substantive number of Turkish population, because at that point of time it had signed labor contracts with Turkey, it had signed contracts with Italy. So there were various host of countries from where these immigrants were coming in, and so essentially what happens is, as I said, what kind of policies were then being put forth? As I said earlier, if you remember, that there were problems at the societal level in terms of acceptance. So you had people coming into work, but that doesn't mean that everything is accepted and people go about their lives easily. And you find that actually there were a lot of discrimination which was happening at all levels, and including spillover to violence and conflict in terms of rights, etc. So the states obviously could not be completely, insulated from this kind of developments which were happening. And for instance, in the UK, you see early on, as a result of the riots in the 50s, you find in the 60s the race relation acts being passed, so which makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of color. So color discrimination being taken care of. So direct discrimination is something which is not legal or made illegal in the laws in 65, 68, and then again 76 revisited, where it went on further to say that direct and indirect discrimination not possible, so made illegal. So in the same way, in the Netherlands, you see that in the Netherlands until recently was looked at as a very, very immigrant friendly country, but that has changed over the past few years. And in the Netherlands, you find that initially the initial reaction was, again, because there were again two types in one sense of people who were coming in. Some were coming in and some were coming in through the labor contracts. So people who were coming in from the colonies, the idea was that they would fit in, and people who were coming from through the labor contracts, the idea was that they would go back. So the policy in the initial years, if you look at Netherlands, is one where the government is really not bothered as to this kind of diversity or heterogeneity which immigration introduces. But again, here you see that in 1979, there is a kind of a turning point. Turning point, why? Because there is a scientific council of the government policy, which brings out a report. And this report actually essentially says that this kind of understanding that the people who have come here are here temporarily for a temporary period of time, and they would go back, and therefore you need not engage with them. You know, they were not even giving them any what is now, if you look at Europe, one of the very critical critical importance so far as policy is concerned is language. Right? You are expected to know the language. You are expected to learn the language, right? So if you look at Netherlands in the early years, you see that the government is not really thinking in terms of language training, because it basically thinks that they are here for a temporary period of time. Too much of knowledge of language, etc., would actually make them think and turn around and actually settle down. So the idea was that they would go back, and that is about it. But 1979, this committee actually brings out a report which criticizes, because this is the post the recession period also. So the prohibitions are in place in the sense that restricted in terms of any more movement of people. And you see that this committee is basically saying that the government cannot actually deny any longer that this country, that Netherlands, has actually become a country de facto. So in fact, it has actually become a country of immigration, and therefore you need to address the questions of this immigrant heterogeneity that has been introduced. So you find that actually in 1983, there is a minorities memorandum of the Dutch government, and the country, which again talks about that the country has changed, and it is required to create conditions of equality. And one of the important things which it does actually is to give people who have had 5 years of residence the opportunity to vote at the local level. So you see political participation. So it's talking in terms of political participation. Then it is between the period 1992 to 1997. It also talks about dual citizenship, right? So dual citizenship. So basically, the idea is that to be a kind of a more immigrant-friendly environment, one could say, where immigration is looked at something which is positive, and you need to do certain things to look at any kind of discrimination or any kind of problems which the immigrants face, and to actually address it and get people more involved. So if you're talking about political participation, if you're talking about allowing dual citizenship, it's all about encouraging more and more participation and sort of, one could say, feeling at home. Then you find that in 1983, there is also the new constitution, which in the very first article actually talks about that everybody needs to be treated equally, irrespective of their circumstances, irrespective of their distinctions on the ground of the belief, religion, political opinion, race. So, and here again, the wording is not citizens. The wording is all persons. So whether you are a citizen or you are a non-citizen doesn't matter. Everybody is entitled to equal treatment. Everybody is entitled. Everybody is entitled not only to equal treatment, also that they are not discriminated on various grounds. Further down, you have in 1994 Equal Treatment Act, which was again to deal with any kind of problems in terms of labor market, and also in the realm of education. So you see, as I said, that the various policies being put in place in terms of looking at that multicultural reality which the country had become, and then responding to it. So also, other than that, very importantly, I think one needs to mention is that that there were in Netherlands subsidized subsidies given to various groups of these immigrants to run their broadcasts. and to also run their schools. So you find in 1985, actually the publicly subsidized Dutch Muslim broadcasting service, and in 1994 a similar service for the Hindus. So then you also have primary schools, Islamic and Hindu primary schools in 1988 coming up, again publicly subsidized. So what I'm basically trying to draw your attention to is that looking at this as I said earlier, or that looked at Netherlands was actually looked at as one of the most immigrant-friendly countries. And now if you look at Netherlands, you can see the complete switch in terms of what has happened in dealing with this diversity. Now, and this kind of a switch is not in Netherlands alone. If you look at UK, again, you see that there has been a switch from multiculturalism to more talk about community cohesion. So that's the official policy now, community cohesion. If you look at Germany again, you see that in 2010, Merkel saying that multiculturalism has failed. Similarly, in France, Sarkozy was talking of multiculturalism has failed. But why he was talking about multiculturalism has failed remains a question, because in any case, to my mind, France was not really looking at, or France was not playing, or not in terms of implementing, even in rudimentary forms, any kind of multicultural policies. So, but nevertheless, what you see is that, post 2001, there is a swing in terms of revisiting the kind of policies which I just gave you a broad, brush about the kind of policies which were there. Essentially, the idea was, if you're looking at multiculturalism, how it translates into policy is that you're using state resources, because the state is recognizing that there are these differences and that these differences matter to the people who belong to these different groups, and therefore they need to be recognized, and one part of that recognition is giving them resources, right? Resources, public resources, taxpayers' money to actually, make possible for them to have their cultural identities maintained, or maintain their cultural identities. So in that sense, as I said, post 2001, you see that there is kind of a shift. And this, to my mind, is a result of two things, both internal and external to Europe. External to Europe in the sense 2001 was the 9/11 attacks. And post that, the whole idea, in terms of identity accommodation and diversity, how do you deal with diversity, seems to have, been drastically revisited. So 9/11 was one marker, and also then within Europe, you see a series of such. Do I have time?
You can conclude now.
Hello.
Should
I continue?
You can conclude now.
Hello?
Ashwati, you can conclude now.
Okay, I'll just take 2 minutes.
Yes,
then,
do that.
So what I'm basically drawing attention to is that there is a reversal of policy, which means that post 2001, one was the external thing in terms of the US terror attacks. And then you see within Europe, terror attacks in Madrid, in London. So all of this in one sense starts a kind of a rethink. The rethink is also because of certain other things, like for instance, in UK in 2001 there were riots in Oldham, Burnley, Bradford, after which there were a series of reports which came out, and with those reports essentially were arguing that multiculturalism on the ground had actually led to people living parallel lives. People were not interacting with each other. They had no idea about the other, and this kind of ghettoed existence and living parallel lives had actually led to little understanding about each other, and this creates situations of conflict and possibilities of violence, right? So the revisit, as I said, was as a result of certain internal developments. In the case of Netherlands, again, there were two things, two murders, one of Pim Fortuyn, who was a very, very strong critique of Islam, and also about the murder of Theo van Gogh, again, another critique of Islam, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was a Somali-born MP in Netherlands, who because of death threats had to move to US. So there are these, kind of developments which happen in terms of involvement of some of the, because this, if you look at the London bomb attacks, it was basically homegrown, right? So people from within had actually mounted those attacks. So this gets the states to actually rethink their policy, and when they rethink their policy, they move away from the kind of policies which were hitherto or being pursued, and they may move towards more stress on community cohesion, more stress on integration, more demands in terms of learning the language, or knowing the host culture, knowing the host culture's history. So all of that becomes very important. So you have citizenship laws, then citizenship tests, which are around, built around this knowledge of the land into which you have come. So basically, you see a kind of a swing. And just one last comment in terms of this swing is also in terms of moving away from multiculturalism. So far as the discourse is concerned, there is also a discourse which is now very much in being debated and being argued in terms of interculturalism. So multiculturalism giving way to interculturalism, whose essential thrust is that social cohesion is important. There are certain universal norms, certain universal values which you need to adhere to, and you need to actually create more contacts between communities. So contact based. So if multiculturalism, which the interculturalist field was creating this parallel ghetto existence, you break that by creating intercultural contact. So you have more spaces which need to be created where people from different cultures can, sort of interact with each other, and this interaction would lead to some kind of more positive development and lead to a kind of a social cohesion. Which is actually what the states are looking at. I'll stop here now. I'm ready to take any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwati.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for
a brilliant exposition of the concept of multiculturalism. Now I invite Professor John Eade, who was the first to join this webinar and has been waiting very patiently. I suppose the deliberations have not tired his patience, and I request him now to come out with his insightful and perspicacious comments and observations. Professor John Eade.
Oh, okay, thank you. I wasn't expecting to say anything, but I was more interested in asking questions, actually.
Yes, please do that.
Okay, so I got a question for Anunna, which I've sent on the chat, actually. So I'll just, perhaps if he looks at it, maybe easier in case he can't understand what I'm saying. So I'd like to ask a question about anti-globalization, because I think the danger talking about globalization is that we adopt a teleological approach, just like modernization theory adopted a similar teleological approach in the 1970s. So in some respects, globalization has followed modernization in its idea of some kind of inevitable historical process. And to me, what's happened is more a dialectical process of anti-globalization in reaction to globalization. And I think that Brexit fits into that, because I think what Brexit's about partly is the whole issue of winners and losers. So in north of England, many people feel very angry because they see globalization destroying their industries, their communities, just as in the Rust Belt in America. So I think this is also linked to development of populism, which you can see across Europe. So that's my question to you. And my question to Baswati is that shouldn't we really be talking about different types of multiculturalism? In other words, multiculturalisms, plural, because there are clearly variety. Tariq Madood in his joint book talks about 3 types of multiculturalism. And that, I think, links to what Anunna's talking about, is that nationalisms and multiculturalisms have become more complicated because of global conditions. So in global conditions, people have been talking about the post-nation state or post-nationalism. The way that the notion states, the way we have to think about it, we have to think about it in some respects in a new way. But of course, what that can do is to generate a kind of virulent modern nationalisms that we see in various parts of the world, and maybe in India too, where religion has been co-opted into a kind of politics of cultural identity. So anyway, that's just my little two questions. Thank you.
Professor Mitro, please respond.
Unmute.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Can you hear me now?
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. That's an interesting moment that you just brought forth about the teleological connection between the idea of modernity and the idea of globalization, because modernity becomes an important construct after the war. But very soon, as you will remember, the whole notion of post-modernity comes into play. And there are people like Derrida and others who start to argue for a postmodern condition. And it becomes curious how globalization fits in with that. But with that being said, if we look at the ground reality, as you rightly said, John, in terms of Brexit, now Brexit comes a little bit before Trump gets elected in the United States. I think the timing was right about then. And many people here felt that Trump would actually win because of the Brexit win, because he was working in the same space of nationalism. And this goes back to Dr. Sarkar's point of view about the economic aspect of globalization, which is, Trump's argument is that, look, let's keep everything in the United States. Let's pull out our people from other parts of the world. Today, when he comes out and uses the virus to make the argument that this is very important for people of Indian origin, that the work visa, the so-called H-1 visa, will be a point of attack, he simply misses the point, because the virus has changed things. The virus has suddenly given the entire world, and goes to Bhashati's point, the labor market has changed. It doesn't matter anymore. Everybody's working from home, right? Where is that home? As one of my friends said, that does it matter if the worker is in Winston-Salem or in Shelda, in Kolkata, right? It does make no difference. And the reality of that is precisely at this moment, when I can be sitting here, Bhashati, I suppose, is in Delhi. I would argue John said he is in London. We are working. This is our labor at this point. I'm not getting paid for this labor, but nevertheless, I'm working, right? Every one of you is working. Labor market has changed. Well, how does it matter where I am anymore? Except where nationalism comes in. So when I go to the McDonald's, to the drive-in, that's where the worker comes right back. And that's what Trump wants to keep white and American. And thus, they return to nationalism. Now, I would argue that is a little bit of that going on in India as well, with the current administration's argument. It's the tagline, Make in India. I suppose that is the tagline, but that fundamentally says that, look, we are pulling back. We are nationalistic. Prime Minister Modi sets the stage for what Trump gets ready to do, talk about coming back to a nationalistic framework as opposed to that global framework. Again, I'm no big supporter of TikTok or WeChat, but 59 Chinese applications banned in India. And then President Trump comes out and says he's going to ban TikTok. He's already banned WeChat, right? So this is the return. This is the post-globalization return, almost like the post-postmodern, right? Because post-modernity was a big threat to that whole idea of nationalism, right? Because post-modernity says that, look, things get pushed back. It's contextual. It is incredibly relativistic. Now we come back and say America is a Christian country. It is not relativistic. God matters, right? So Trump can now tell about Joe Biden that he opposes God. What an amazing move by a man who stands with a fake Bible in front of the church in Washington, D.C., when he pushes the protesters out so he can get there. So the return of God, and hey, what happened in India on August 5th, without getting in too much into that, the return of God, and God and nationalism gets reconnected. I don't know if I took it to where you wanted to take it, John, but I think that's basically the reality. And it's too new, guys. I mean, we as researchers, the data is overwhelming. How the heck do we put this in some theoretical framework other than what vitally importantly John is pointing towards, the teleological connections? That's what we need to do as researchers. Go beyond the facts now, put this thing together. I'll shut up and let others jump in.
So it is for Bhashwati now to respond.
Yes.
Yes, it is for Bhashwati to respond now.
Bhashwati, you're muted. You're muted. You have to.
Yeah. Is it okay? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Please go on.
Regarding the observation which John has made regarding, multiculturalism, that whether we can talk of multiculturalism or multiculturalisms, I think you have a valid point there in terms of that the various ways in which it has been looked at. For instance, some would say that there is something called symbolic multiculturalism, right? Where you are talking basically of what is said, saris, samosas, and steel drums, the 3S. The 3S multiculturalism, which is symbolic multiculturalism, where you basically look at certain symbols of culture which can be celebrated. So you have festivals, and this is how you know each other. You celebrate that in your multicultural environment, in your festivals, in your multicultural school environments, multicultural educational environments. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is more with the structural thing, right? That structural multiculturalists who basically say would be arguing that that there are just by celebrating doesn't mean that you can overcome the kind of discrimination and marginalization that people face in everyday life. So you need to look at the structures and you need to actually address those structures when we are trying to create a real multicultural society with equity and justice. The third is also which Parekh talks about, the dialogical multiculturalism, where you need to dialogue with different cultures, right? Which is more towards the kind of argument which the interculturalists are making. So multiculturalists, when they're talking in terms of that different cultures need to dialogue with each other, need to understand each other. That is again another way of looking at it. So yes, one could talk about these various ways in which multiculturalism has been understood and what it means in terms of policies. So I would agree with you there, and but the point which I'm basically trying to also make is that how how important cultural markers become when you look at the question of discrimination, and when you look at this the kind of say obstructions, a kind of problems that people face when they try to say get jobs, or they try to go for education. So there are so many writings which point out in the context of France, in the context of Denmark, and again I find Denmark is a very interesting case in the Nordic countries. Very, very critical laws which have been passed of late regarding how they deal with cultural diversity, and especially what I think one needed to mention when I was talking is also that increasingly one would see that immigrants can be slashed into Muslims. So this idea about the other in terms of, and the problematic other is something which is interesting to see, and how those cultural markers that there are, as I said, instances where if a person who, lady who is working with her peers in an office is completely acceptable till she wears a headscarf. So the day she decides to wear the headscarf and moves into office, then she finds that the world around her has changed. So multiculturalism in that sense, what the questions which they put up, those questions still remain, because I don't see that kind of cultural acceptance and respect for culture and the cultural difference that is around is actually progressing, or actually it is growing. Rather, what has happened, as I said, in the post-2001 period, is that there is a kind of a backlash And that backlash has meant very, very real things in terms of people of different cultures when they access, say, jobs, when they access their education, when they go about their lives. So, for instance, John, since you are in UK, not some time back, they had this those leaflets which were circulated, "Hate a Muslim Day." Right, so you had those 5, 6, or I think 10 things which you could do, and you would be rewarded in terms of what. If you did a verbal abuse, if you tear down the veil, so that kind of this sheer kind of reaction to difference that to this day you find that I think this was in 2017 or 2018 these leaflets had come out. Yes, there were counter leaflets, Love a Muslim Day, but those were counter leaflets, and that's something interesting. So you're not sort of reactive. And I think you made a very valid point when you're talking about the rise of populism across Europe. And then not just the rise of populism, how mainstream political parties are there then looking at the discourse, changing their discourse as a result of this rise of populism. I think I'll stop here now, and if there are more things, I mean, I'm sure we can discuss it.
We invite more questions. Is there anybody else who would like to ask anything?
I saw a question on the chat from Debolina Debnath.
Yes.
Yeah, that question is very interesting.
Please answer. Yes, you answer.
Yeah. Bengali Muslims in America. How interestingly it has been phrased. Notice the language that Debolina has used is intriguing to me. This question could have been asked in two other ways. One is, Professor Mitra, what about the condition of Americans who are Bengali Muslims? Or it could have been asked as conditions of Muslim Americans of Bengali origin, or I guess those are the two ways. Notice, language is so fundamentally important to the construction of the narrative of the identity. In this question, Debolina, you have chosen to privilege the Bengali identity over the Muslim identity and then the American identity. And that becomes intriguing in an ethnocentric or an ethno-cultural system because what am I? I have lived here for so many years, and I would privilege my Bengali identity over any other identity at this moment. I'm surely an American, and I am not Muslim, but that would not even be a part of my identity structure. Does that make sense? So in this global system, how we define the other, even in our question, becomes very intriguing, and it actually exposes the narratives that are circulating. That Muslim becomes an important part of the narrative. I'm not denying that by any means. I mean, with the Muslim ban of Trump and everything that Trump has done to create an other out of Muslims is just horrendous. But to answer the question, now that I've critiqued the question in a positive way, I hope, to answer the question is, I suppose we as Bengalis do not feel, or we as Indians primarily, do not feel that level of discrimination that other minorities feel in the United States. Our identity has primarily been rotating around the fact that we are of Indian origin. Most Americans, given their level of ignorance, don't even understand that India has Muslims. If you're Indian, you don't eat beef and you're Hindu. So that's where the identity narrative ends. So overall, I would argue that we have been okay. We have been okay. That would be the best way of putting it. How long we'll be okay will be decided on November 3rd. And we hope to continue to remain okay. So I'll shut up with that. And Debolina, I'd like to, if you want to respond to what I just said, I'd love to hear that. And I noticed another thing in the chat. It just says, I have a question to me. So I'll shut up and let questions come up, or however.
Yes. What is the next question? What is the question? And who is the questioner?
Sorry, can I just add to that? I don't want to dominate. It's a similar issue in London.
Oh, Professor Eid,
which I found in, my 30 odd years of writing about Bangladeshi settlement, to what extent are they Bengalis, are they Siletis, are they Bangladeshis, etc., etc. So these kind of complex multiple identities bound up with language is so important.
Thank you. But I think Debolina has responded to Professor Anunna Vitro, saying that she has got his point.
Right, I saw that.
Any other question? Sound is any other question from anybody else? Then it is for me then to wind up the session.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes. What's your name, please? Your name?
I'm Dr. Rajesh Das from University of Bardhaman. Professor Anunna Vitro.
Yes.
Sir, in your introductory note, you explained the concept of Americanization. So from Americanization, I want to mention another concept, and this concept is very familiar in our media world, and is the McDonaldization culture. Sir, considering this McDonaldization sphere, actually what is the actual architecture of post-globalization society? Sir, it's a society, just an information-based society, or a community with a defined cyberspace, or a community just a techno-biased urbanization. One side, sir. Another, if we consider the another frame, then we may consider that community has a significant interference over on any diasporic society. Sir, do you think in this present global society, it's continuously losing its community sense? Means community sense overall psychological cohesion or cultural cohesion or any dialogic cohesion. So this is this two consecutive part or observation in this way.
Can I just add on to that, Professor Vitro? Can I just add on?
Sure, yeah.
So, Professor Vitro, Rajesh just mentioned about global society. Do you think that there is a global society, even in the making, given the fact that you just said that, we all seem to be looking as a result of globalization and the way globalization has created its own losers, we are basically looking at states which are now looking inwards, and nationalism seems to be the flavor. So do you really see any kind of global society in the offing? And the other thing which I would like to ask you is, what about the elections? Where do you see the elections going this time?
Okay.
I think there are two other questions from Orgho Shukul and I think Agrani Club. Would you please put your questions, please? Then Professor Vitro can take all of them together and then answer.
Yes, and let me say one thing before you say anything else. Raya Bhattacharya, your microphone is on and it is creating some disturbance. Yeah, thank you. All right, go ahead, ask the other questions, please.
Sir, it is myself, Agrani Club. Not it is Agrani Club, sir, it is myself, Vivekananda Roy, from Dinabandhu Andrews College, Goria. It is added somehow with me, and I am not in a position to remove it from my name. So, sir, my question is, intellectual people are calling this situation is a new normal. Sir, will you please tell why it is new normal instead of abnormal situation? Whatever we are continuing before March, and that was our normal life. Why it is new normal to us, and what is the specific features of this new normal, sir? And when should we enter into our previous normal life? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. What was the other question? Or is there another question?
Yeah, Orgho Shukul wanted to ask something.
Do you want to ask the question?
Where is Orgho Shukul? Do I see him here on the screen? I don't.
Okay, let me try this. Right, let me try this. This is a series of interconnected questions, and let's consider this issue of community. This is a huge term that both Dr. Dash and Dr. Sarkar have brought up, and it's been talked about. Is there a new global community? Is this global community going to be based around what? So let me take you back a little bit. This whole idea of nation state, which is a fundamental idea of organizing our civilizations, was called into question actually with the event that Dr. Sarkar mentions in 2001, which is 9/11. 9/11 becomes very interesting because this is where, for perhaps the first time, the world was facing a threat that did not belong to a nation state. When you think about Al-Qaeda did not belong to a nation state. It was a collection of people who had a specific ideology, however destructive, and they had a specific enemy or set of specific enemies, which made the battle with Al-Qaeda particularly. There's some noise. I think, Mr. Mukherjee, can you mute yours? Okay, so the idea of community, the idea of building some form of community around a term that I have used in my writing before. Shomit, can you mute your?
Yes,
can somebody send a chat message to Shomit to mute his sound?
Yes, I am. Okay.
So the idea of community becomes connected to what I would call commonality. Way back when I was writing about the technologies that were emerging in the 80s and 90s, I made the argument, and others made the argument, that there will be new virtual communities. And that's precisely what we are looking at. These are virtual communities. This community that I'm sitting in right now is a virtual community. What brings us together? What brings us together is that title that Dr. Mukherjee offered in terms of the topic of this discussion. You can expand this out quite a bit. You can start to say that these communities will expand, whether these will become communities where labor can be done, where wages can be earned, where there will be economic activity is a different question. But I'm more interested in the cultural aspect of the community. And I think these communities will only continue as we go further, independent of the virus, actually, because it was becoming clear that we are an interconnected world, even though there are these calls for nationalism by national leaders. And we have moments where there is this super hyper nationalism, and you're saying, I'm not going to wear a mask because it's un-American, or I am going to lay the foundations or join in to the first reading of the prayers at Hagia Sophia. You know, those are moments of nationalism connected with religion and so forth, and nobody better than John can talk about that. But the fact is, we will find a way to form our communities. And those communities will become fundamental to our identities and our existence. And those communities may not be real ones, but increasingly virtual ones, which sounds really weird to say that we have entered a new phase. And thus the question from Ogni Club, which is, why is this a new normal? Why is this either not abnormal or I didn't think you offered another option, but you called it abnormal, as opposed to the new normal. Truly, this is abnormal. For you and me, it is abnormal because I would argue, even as I can see you're much younger than me, even for us, for this population here, we are analog beings. We are not very comfortable. I don't think I'm very comfortable with this mode of conversation that we have here, right? This is why it is abnormal. Why could it be new normal? Well, there are digital natives, what we call in technology, people who grew up in the digital. Some of you actually did. Some of you actually did grow up in the digital. I can pose this question among my younger friends here, and you probably don't even know what a cassette tape looks like. or what a vinyl record looks like. May not be in your case, but I've encountered that. To them, this is normal. So this is not even new. You see what I'm saying? They live through Instagram. They live through Spotify. This is fine. This is how it is. We talk over this. For us, it is a new normal. Because until and unless we can find an alternative to this form of community, which has proven to be attractive to big capital. Imagine what companies can do now, as I said earlier. You don't have H-1 visas. You don't need that. You employ them in India. You employ them in the Philippines. You don't pay them American wages. You pay them Indian wages. All of a sudden, IBM making a shitload of money because they have moved this out. This is their new normal. We don't worry about employment. The wages will be different. So I'm all over the place in my answer, but I hope I'm getting at the point, which is to go back to Dr. Dash's original question. Is there a new framework for community? I think it's around commonality, things that bring us together. That's the Bengali diaspora. Is there, will there be, and I'm going back to Dr. Sharkar's question. It's connected with Rajesh's question. I think the same answer holds. We are looking at constructions of community which will not be based on traditional notions of community of space and time, but it will really be on ideology, on topics that are similar. And thus, to me, it's a new normal. It is not abnormal because this was coming. Does that make sense? So I'm going to shut up and reopen it for responses to what I just said.
So there's one question to Mr. Mitro. One question has been put by
Sir, after the vaccination will come, shall we not enter into the our normal life?
I seriously,
new normal,
or whoever, or a return to a normal that we knew before March 1st of 2020. Dr. Mukherjee, I would answer that question in two different ways. Number one, I go back, and I don't know if Dr. Ghosh is still in our group, but I'd go back to the science. There is no guarantee at this moment that the vaccine will be the end all of this. We might need vaccinations over and over again. The data right now coming out of epidemiology is suggesting that even if you have had the disease, your immunity could disappear between 30 and 90 days. So, and the disease is mutating. So yes, it will be a vaccine which will give us some degree of protection, but we will probably continue to see this disease now that it is amongst us for a long period of time. So that's the first question. So we may not return to what life was like before March. The second part of the answer would be there, and that's an economic political answer, more economic, is there, people have found an advantage in this. No doubt, millions of jobs are lost. But at the same time, big corporations might find this an opportunity to do things differently, where they will say that capital wins. And therefore, think about, I was thinking about a company in India, I think it's Wipro or one of the major technology companies that came out and told their employees that, look, you can work from home for the next 1 year. Why are they doing that? Well, you think about the amount of savings, right? I don't have to go. Imagine this thing for John and me. Had we done this in the original way, I would probably be sitting in Pollani right now, right? Imagine the amount of money that has been saved. All it has cost me to do this is a little bit of my time and a cup of coffee, right? That's where the new normal becomes an economic imperative. And we should not lose sight of that. These opportunities have been taken before, and this opportunity has been presented. When the internet came along, all of a sudden we had outsourcing. The call centers mushrooming in Bangalore and outside of Delhi. That has stayed with us. So this could continue, and we may not return to that old place anymore. That's my sense, but I'll shut up again.
Thank you.
All right, sir. We have to wait for that.
Now, we have just 1 week. We have time for one more question by Orgo Shukul. His question is, how is the Bengali diaspora in India different from other diasporas? Would any of the two speakers, would Professor Mitro like to respond to this?
But I suppose Orgho is asking the question in terms of Jita. I'm going to switch to a Bengali word. John, I will translate this word for you. Probashi Bangali. Probashi. The word Probashi is outside of Bengal. Anybody outside of Bengal traditionally is considered a Probashi Bangali, right? As a matter of fact, even in the 60s and 70s, if a young man, my cousin brother, got a job and he was going to be posted somewhere in Jaipur, and the family said, "Here poschime chole jabi, you're going off to the west," right? Nowadays, we didn't think about it that way. I think the diaspora in India of Bengalis, I have very little experience other than CR Park in Delhi, where I've spent a fair amount of time, is somewhat different from what we experience merely because of access to resources. The access to resources is incredibly important. In the United States, I would argue that the Bengali diaspora can be subdivided, not so much by religion, but by location. People living in the urbanized parts of the US have far greater access to Bengali resources than somebody like me who lives in a smaller town in the US. In my town, and I'm using examples, in my town, there's literally maybe 4 other people in my city with whom I can talk in Bangla. Whereas if I was sitting in Washington, D.C., I would probably never talk in any other language other than Bangla when I get together for weekend gatherings, right? So that's the same for the Indian diaspora, I would argue, has greater access. Because even in smaller parts of India, there are Bengali associations, there are Bengali communities. So it really is a matter of access to me. But others who have experienced the Probashi experience in India, I'd love to hear from you guys.
Thank you, Professor Mitro. Now it's the time to wind up. And I won't take much time. Professor Mitro, I think he hasn't even had the time to have his cup of tea early in the morning yet to join this webinar. So I wouldn't take much of his time. Now, for the vote of thanks. I am eternally beholden to the CIRM office, whose indefatigable labors have made this webinar possible. They have worked. In fact, 2 of them are still with us, one from Bhubaneswar and the other from Murshidabad. And I am immeasurably indebted to the Secretariat of the Honorable Vice Chancellor, which has worked with me from dawn to dusk. No word of praise, no word of gratitude can be adequate here. I thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor from the core of my heart. I thank all the professors from different disciplines who have joined this webinar. I also thank, finally, the 2 speakers. I'll first come to Bhashwati. Bhashwati's lecture was extremely illuminating, informative, and very well documented. When I introduced the theme of the webinar, Bhashwati had not been able to join at that time due to some, I think, network problems. She joined a bit later. When I introduced the theme of the seminar, I said that the seminal question which the webinar wanted to address was whether in these tumultuous times, the very concept of multiculturalism will be able to sustain its validity, its efficacy, its legitimacy, and its credibility. Or has the time come to write the epitaph of multiculturalism? Bhashwati has established that despite all the breathtaking changes that have taken place, multiculturalism can be revisited, and it is indeed being revisited, and it is now giving way to what may be called interculturalism, community cohesion. She has also referred to the colored migrants and the tribulations they had to encounter when they found themselves in a different land in search of a new life, new livelihood. I can just mention here that in Australia, Many of the immigrant students are facing difficulties. The Prime Minister, Mr. Scott Morrison, has issued a declaration that in the era of pandemic, those students who cannot support themselves can return, or they are advised to return. And this has produced a very negative impact on the immigrant student community. They are disheartened, they are demoralized, they are depressed, and they are, I would say, extremely, disillusioned, because they contribute a large chunk, a substantial chunk of the I would say the income, nearly $37 billion dollars, and they are now gripped with a kind of an existential crisis, and in fact they have expressed their disenchantment on occasions more than one. So the question is that difficulties are there, challenges are there, but the concept is also there. The concept will go through changes, the concept will go through modifications, the concept will go through transformations also. That has been brilliantly explicated by Bhashwati. I thank her profusely for such a beautiful and such an erudite presentation. Professor Anunna Vitro impressed me in a different way. The two speakers impressed me in two different ways. Professor Anunna Vitro was so eloquent, he really held us spellbound. He was captivating. And I really felt very inspired. In fact, when he expressed his nostalgic affinity to the Bengali community, referring to the Calcutta Boys School. And in fact, this is the kind of a nostalgic affinity which many Bengali diaspora community members still nurture in the heart of their hearts. And they retain their Bengali identity. And that is what I think something which they cherish throughout their life. Though now they have left their motherland for a different homeland, but that nostalgic affinity still remains. And one point which he made, and with this I shall conclude, that was indelibly stamped on my mind, though I've just lowered my mask because I'm talking. I have gloves here in both my hands, so I couldn't even take notes. One point which he made was that it is incredibly difficult for an individual to think globally. I think I've got you right, sir. I think these were the exact words which you used. And these were so inspiring. And it reminded me of the famous words of the bearded gentleman of Shantiniketan, poet Rabindranath Tagore, who said, and I think you will find the most resonant reverberations of what you had said in what our poet laureate had written long ago, that leave behind your narrow self and step out into the outside world. There in the inner recesses of your heart, the flag of the greater world will be unfurled. Apon hote bahir hoye baire dara, buker majhe bishwo loker pabi shara. I think that sums up the whole thing. As the director of the Center for Studies on Bengali Diaspora, I offer my heartfelt thanks to all the participants, the speakers, and the university staff who have really made this webinar I would say a great success, because I was going through the responses that were constantly being printed on the screen. And I think all those who attended the webinar were really benefited and enriched by it. And thank you, Professor John Eade, for being with us right from the beginning. And I would like to have you as the main speaker in the future programs also. Thank you all. So we wind up now. The best wishes from the core of my heart, and all the best.
Thank you. Thank you for including us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.
Sir, Anunna sir, Kolkata আসলে please inform করবেন, accordingly we'll
Sure. Absolutely. We'll have more programs, and all of you will be duly informed. Thank you. So we wind up now.
Okay. Have a good day.
Sir. Good night.
Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Sign out.
সাইন আপ করে বেরোবেন এমনি হচ্ছে
সবকটা থেকে সাইন আপ করতে হবে, একটা থেকে করলেই হবে।
ওটা এটিএস এর রাউন্ডার লাগবে। হ্যাঁ বুঝতে পেরেছি টেলিফোন লাইন ইন এন্ড আউট থাকবে। হ্যাঁ দেখছি আমি, এটা আমার মনে ছিল বলে তোমার সাথে একটা কথা বলতাম। ওকে নো প্রবলেম, ট্রাই মাই বেস্ট।
আচ্ছা একটু টয়লেট যাও, আমি কিন্তু
নিশ্চয়ই
সিকিউরিটি লোকের জন্য দুটো এনেছি।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ বলতে পাওয়া যায় রিসিভার থেকে। কেন আসতো না বলে আমি অতটা খরচ করছিলাম না, যে তাকে প্রভাবদার টান থাকলে নিশ্চয়ই দৌড়ে আসতো, যদি রিসিপ্টটা প্রভাবদার প্রতি থাকতো। ঠিক আছে, তুমি দেখছি আমি এডিএসএল রাউটারটা জোগাড় করব। হ্যাঁ দেখে দেখে তোমায় জানাবো। প্রদীপদা একটা এডিএসএল রাউটার জোগাড় করতে হবে। কি করবো?
দেশের মেয়ের কাছে বন্ধ দেয় বিরোধে গেছে। ওর কাছে আবার ইয়ে আছে কিনা, চারটে অ্যান্টেনা আছে।
আর অ্যান্টেনা না হলেও চলো, দু অ্যান্টেনা তো চলো।
সে বাদ করে গেছে।
আপনাদের একটা কাজ বললে করেন না, ওয়াদারকে ভিসি বলেছে। ওয়াদার এটা লাগবে, ওই একদিন বলে টলে উনি ব্যাস চ্যাপ্টার ক্লোজ করে বাড়ি চলে গেছে। আমাকে দৌড়ে দৌড়ে জোগাড় করে ওকে ডেকে এনে কাজ করাতে। এত মাথায় নেবো কেন? তুমি আমাকে আরেকবারও বলেছো যে আমার অমিত আমারটা ব্যবহার করো, ব্যবস্থা করো। এই ডিএসএল রাউটার যদি জোগাড় হয়ে যায়, সুভাষের কাছে দোকানেই থাকবে। ওকে বলবো যাওয়ার সময় বিরাটে গিয়ে আমার কথা বললেই বিরাট দিয়ে দেবে, ব্যাস এইটুকু হয়ে